I'd like to continue on from last week when Dr. Ray reminded us that the Easter message is given, in his words, in the face of a broken heart. When your life has been broken and the shattered pieces are lying all around your feet, heaven is not the issue. Tomorrow is the issue. Not in an imaginary world do we find salvation in the clouds, but right here, right now, in the only life we know anything about. When I come to an ancient text, especially a text like the resurrection of Jesus, some of the basic questions I carry with me whenever I go to read them are, why was this worth remembering to the people who remembered it? How did they tell this story, and how were they changed in the telling of it? Why is this story worth remembering now? In the case of the Gospels, they particularly speak to the experience of those living amid what Walter Brueggemann describes as the destructiveness of empire. It's a world that is still devastatingly familiar to billions of human beings around the world, across geographies and across cultures. These oppressive systems and the injustices that they bring with them are the usual topics of our Sundays together as we refuse to stand idly by. So it is that we recognize ourselves and our loved ones in these stories. Brueggemann connects them together by inviting us to, quote, imagine a world of life come amid the destructiveness of empire. It is this life carrier who said to his followers, I give you the power to forgive sin. I recruit you for the forgiveness business. I charge you with healing, transformative reconciliation. It was then and always is a hard work for the church because in the empire there is no free lunch, no open hand, no breaking of the vicious cycles of fear and violence and failure. So, he said, here's my pitch. Imagine that you and I today are part of the Easter movement of civil disobedience that contradicts the empire. Let's see what happens. Let's see if life is longer than death. Brueggemann's description of the contradiction between empire death and Easter life is a pathway to reflect both on the everyday choices we make and the movements we build. Looking back over the Easter reflections I've shared the last few years, this stands out to me. There is a litany of suffering that mirrors the crucifixion, followed by a determination to keep going, insisting on creating just, joyful, equitable communities. And that mirrors the resurrection. As I said last Easter, we live in the hope that the world can be different and that we can be part of the difference. So we keep repeating these old stories to remember the choices we are making between empire death and Easter life, and to make those choices clearer and more compelling. One of the moments in my own life when that choice became clearer came to me during the summer semesters of 1997 and 1998 when I was teaching English at Leningrad Oblast Pedagogical Institute in Pushkin on the edge of St. Petersburg, Russia. It was a wonderful time, and I still have some favorite stories that make it in my list of personal greatest hits. Chief among them is probably Vladislav telling Jim, I only break the law for you. And a close second, maybe the time I found myself singing Old MacDonald Has a Farm in broken Russian on a public bus on the way to the airport. And if you want to know those stories, you have to come to church on Sunday. It was also my firsthand exposure to the liturgy and iconography of the Orthodox Church. I would wander those old cathedrals and chapels, many operating only as museums at the time, and soak up the images and the architecture. One icon in particular repeatedly stood out to me. The descriptions in English called it the descent into hell, or the harrowing of hell, though a more straightforward translation would have simply named it the resurrection. It was a depiction of the resurrection of Jesus, unlike any I'd ever seen in my Southern Baptist Sunday school quarterlies, though. Jesus is shown striding purposely through the underworld, looking back over his shoulder as he takes two ancient-looking people by the hand and pulls them up out of the grave with him. Usually there are other tombs behind them with prophets and prominent figures also emerging into new life. And often under Jesus' feet is a chained figure who looks surprised and even frightened. It isn't some devil or Satan himself. It's the personification of death's kingdom. Hades' long rule is at an end, with the gates and the doors, the locks and the bolts shattered and scattered on the ground. And the broken gates are often depicted as falling across one another to form an image of the cross. The two ancient-looking folks at the front of the line are Adam and Eve, a symbol of the whole human race and of universal resurrection. It was called anastasis, meaning to stand up again. That literal translation is the basis of an argument that the harrowing of hell is a poor substitute for resurrection, and I get the point. But I'm personally also fond of the image of harrowing hell, although not for any good academic reason. There are multiple meanings when it comes to this harrowing, and the one that's almost certainly meant here is from an Old English word meaning to ravage, plunder, seize, or capture. In that sense, the resurrection was portrayed as a conquest, a military victory against the army of death. We also know from Shakespeare that you can harrow someone's feelings, leaving them feeling distressed. Thankfully, in 1997, I wasn't aware of either of those meanings at all. So when I heard the name, the harrowing of hell, my mind went immediately to agriculture. A harrow, that heavy rake that was used to break up the soil to prepare it for planting. And hadn't Jesus said that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. And the image of a seed in the earth, well, that's a dear one to me. I especially love how a seed settling into the soil transforms the common negative associations many cultures have about darkness. The soil holds the seed in safety and nurtures it. The darkness in the soil holds the seed while it awaits the right time to respond to the sun and the rain and stretch itself into a tender green shoot. But even then, it remains rooted in the soil. In Denise Levertov's poem, Eye Mask, the poet rests in the dark, unready for the light. I need, she wrote, more of the night. Before I open eyes and heart to illumination, I must still grow in the dark like a root, not ready at all. Similarly, David White describes the sweet darkness as a womb that nourishes us in wisdom, freedom, and joy. Sometimes, he said, it takes darkness and the sweet confinement of your aloneness to learn anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you. This is why that image of Jesus taking Adam and Eve by the hand resonates so strongly with me. From a psychosocial perspective, the work for social change also requires tending the wounds, going into the darkness and the sweet confinement of our aloneness. This is something that my own early religious and cultural traditions failed to equip me to do at all. We were not allowed to have struggles unless those struggles were past tense. At church, I learned well that I shouldn't talk about a problem until after that problem was solved. We were encouraged to rededicate our lives. I mean, that was a great thing to do. And it was an acknowledgement of those problems, but the rededication communicated that we weren't going to cause any trouble to anyone else. I don't even know if there was anyone who could acknowledge that I was so often in the darkness, let alone go with me into those spaces. If there was that possibility, it was hidden from me. The obscurity was intensified by the nearly constant messages about how unworthy and evil I was. And that version of faith, that it made me especially dangerous because evil and impurity were contagious. I learned that goodness was a limited good, something that could be exhausted, something that could be spoiled. But I caught a glimpse of another possibility in the stories about Jesus. These stories upended everything, including my own fear and self-loathing. In the everyday world, ritual impurity made people outsiders. Being different made you an outsider. Having trauma made you an outsider. We were feared because impurity was contagious. Our very presence could pose a risk for others because that impurity could spread and others would share our rejection. But in the stories with Jesus, that was all reversed. It was wholeness that was contagious. And that is the heart of many of the miracle stories, with Jesus upending the expected outcomes. And it's not limited to cases of ritual impurity either, those stories that we think about immediately, like healing of leprosy or the woman with the issue of blood. For example, in the tale of the feeding of 5,000 people, when the disciples wanted to send the crowd away because there wasn't enough food, their scarcity was contagious. They were afraid of their own lack and couldn't risk missing their own dinner on what was sure to be a failed attempt at a group picnic. But with Jesus, abundance was contagious and they had leftovers. In the tales of sailing on a stormy sea, the storms were terrifying and dangerous, and the disciples' fear, that was reasonable, and it was contagious. Their panic spread to one another, and that was a proper response to being caught in a storm on the sea. But Jesus is shown to be an exception. His peace was so contagious that even the sea became calm. The resurrection stories fit that pattern. Jesus' goodness, his wholeness, his abundance is contagious in the Gospels. So when the powers that be assumed that killing Jesus would also kill the community of Jesus' followers, that was a practical assumption. They very reasonably thought that Jesus' death would be contagious, signaling the death of the community and movement of those who followed him. But in the Gospels, Jesus' life was so contagious that even death gets infected and comes back to life. Hell was harrowed. Adam and Eve got up again, and the movement didn't die. Growing up, I had absorbed the idea that my needs needed to come last, if they came at all. I understood that my woundedness, any woundedness that I experienced, would be interpreted as a lack of faithfulness, even as a moral failure. And that was part of the marginalization I experienced, and an example of how empire greases the wheels of domination. It was important to hide my needs and to hide my woundedness because woundedness was weakness. So it also became easy to confuse woundedness for some deficiency in me, a failure or a sin, reinforcing my own self-loathing. Contemplating the Orthodox icons of the resurrection, the harrowing of hell, was part of my own seeing through those lies. The Easter story became an invitation to enter into the healing work I needed to do, to harrow my own hells. I learned that when you are wounded, faithfulness looks like healing. I learned to stop judging what I needed to do when I was wounded by what I was able to do when I was well. I learned that I couldn't judge myself into wholeness. The role judgment had was to help me understand what needed to be healed and how to heal it. It was not ever meant to leave me feeling guilty for needing healing. Punishing myself for having wounds, that wasn't going to speed up the process. If I wanted to demonstrate faithfulness in the face of empire, I would need to tend my wounds and harrow my hells. I would need to learn to love myself, heal, and come to life. I needed to go into the safety of the darkness and let the earth become a womb. After all, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Returning to the question of why and how these kinds of stories were remembered, John Dominic and Sarah Crossan remind us that there was a gap between Israel's faith in a creator God of distributive justice and the people's experience of being caught between superpowers, warring first on a north-south and then on an east-west axis, to hold on to their convictions within a world of imperial injustice and political oppression. They envisioned a future where war's violent injustice would be transformed into peace's nonviolent justice, here below upon a transformed earth. Importantly, this was also a universal resurrection. It was not about earth's destruction, but its transformation. Jesus' life and ministry flowed out of and embodied that vision, but with the insistence that the transformation was meant to begin and blossom right now. John and Sarah wrote that Jesus' kingdom of God represents a paradigm shift, a tradition swerve, a disruptive innovation within this contemporary matrix. For Jesus, the kingdom is already present, but only if, when, and as humans accept it, participate in it, collaborate with it, enter into it, and take it upon themselves. The trouble is that this kind of transformation is disruptive to those oppressive systems of domination that rule our world and our lives. The crucifixion was meant to be and was a warning of that. As Brueggemann also points out, Jesus collided with the will and the purpose of the Roman Empire and with the Jews who colluded with the empire. He's not crucified because of some theory of atonement. He's crucified because the empire cannot tolerate such a transformative, subversive force set loose in the world. Jesus' uncompromising commitment to the purpose of God contradicted the empire that lives against the grain of God's intention. The crucifixion was meant to tidy up all the loose ends of resistance to empire that existed in the Jesus movement, resistance to the normalization of oppression and domination. In such a world, there really is not much choice. If the empire kills us, we must come back to life. Resurrection is resistance. We turn the grave into a garden. We turn our suffering into seeds. We turn our hells into healing. We rise again and again and again. As immigration justice activists have powerfully spoken and embodied over the last several years, we also remember they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. Happy Easter.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.